Well, he was the son of a banker raised amid privilege. So why would the suspect in last week's failed terror plot turn toward extremism? There's a series of internet postings that may actually provide a clue. I want to go to Steve Cole. He's written extensively about al-Qaeda. He's a former Washington Post journalist. He writes for The New Yorker, and he's president of the New America Foundation. Steve, thanks for joining us here. We take a look at the background here of Abdul Muttalib, and he was from a privileged family, very highly educated, traveled the world. Does this surprise you, the profile, that he was the one who was responsible, allegedly, for this attack?
It's a common profile, particularly among leadership and the talented sectors of the Islamist radical movement. In fact, it's the profile of Osama bin Laden himself and the number 2 in al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, both products of privilege, in their cases in Saudi and Egyptian society, who became both recruited at a young age into radical Islamic teachings, but also privileged to travel the world and to start to visualize a war that crossed borders. And while the attacker in this case was a much more junior member, like a lot of other suicide bombers before him, he seems to have gone from his home country to another place where he felt dislocated and became recruited, and then sort of traveled from there into a wider war.
I want to talk a little bit about the dislocation you mentioned here, because he has some postings online here, one of them very revealing about how lonely he was. He says, first of all, I have no friends, not because I do not socialize, but because either people do not want to get too close to me as they go partying and stuff, and while I don't, or they are bad people who befriend me and influence me to do bad things, I have no one to speak to, no one to consult, no one to support me. I feel depressed and lonely. I do not know what to do. Is that typical?
Well, you know, we've seen some of these narratives in the United States where you think about people who have gone on shooting sprees at university campuses and the stories that got them there. I mean, it's a radicalization narrative is as complex as a weather system. You know, you have elements of push and pull. The push is being away from home, losing your sense of place, your sense of identity and search, and the pull is the teachings and the mentorship that some of these Islamic organizations try to provide as a substitute for family and as a substitute for culture.
But what struck me are some of the things that seem so normal for a young man his age to be thinking out. Here's one of them, like he was worried about the SATs, scoring 1,200 in SATs. I tried the SAT, he wrote in March 2005. It was a disaster. I mean, this is a very practical, westernized young man. How does he go from that to becoming potentially a suicide bomber? How does that happen? Well,
it's a mystery. Obviously, not everyone who worries about the SAT becomes a suicide bomber, so it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to be dislocated, to be away from your own sense of identity and purpose, and then to be recruited. The pull part is equally important. Once al-Qaeda groups find a recruit, they do train and indoctrinate, just as other military organizations do, to try to persuade them that this is a righteous act, suicide. It's a military act in their judgment, not an act of personal destruction. And teaching that takes time, and it takes an environment in which trust is built between trainer and trainee.
You wrote a book in the 1980s about how al-Qaeda was born in Yemen. And that was before this suspect, Abdul Muttalib, was even in Afghanistan, not Yemen. But he wasn't even born when you wrote that book. How is al-Qaeda different today? How is it the new generation different than the one that you wrote about in the 80s?
Well, you know, there's some patterns of change and some patterns of continuity, and this idea of young, talented men crossing borders and becoming part of a globalized war, that's actually been an aspect of al-Qaeda's strength from the very beginning. Again, bin Laden and Zawahiri are examples of this, but the pilots on the 9/11 planes were themselves similar stories in some cases. A young man raised in Egypt goes to school in Germany, becomes radicalized, goes to Afghanistan, receives training, and then travels to the United States. So these are modern figures. These are young men who feel comfortable in a globalized culture, but have also been radicalized in a doctrine that wants to destroy that culture.
Steve Cole, thank you so much for your insights.
My
really
pleasure,
appreciate
Suzanne.
it.
Sure.